Book: Justice, Insurance, and Luck. 1. Introduction. Bad day for justice. The 1996 Welfare Reform Act was a plain defeat for social justice. According to a New England... What? Ah non, pardon. Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996, Public Law. The Act is popularly known as the end of welfare as we know it. Welfare is used in the rest of this book in the more technical sense it has acquired in philosophical and economic literature, but in this chapter I use it in the more familiar political sense to refer to government programs that transfer funds to citizens who are needy. The president had campaigned on the promise, among others, to end welfare as we know it, and he insisted, in signing the act, that a radical revision of the long-standing federally financed welfare scheme was necessary. Though some of the more punitive provisions of this bill were regrettable, he said, the bill as a whole was the best that could be expected from the Republican Congress, and some reform was better than none at all. Clinton's claim that the existing welfare scheme had failed and must be replaced by something else was unchallenged, even by those who urged him to veto the bill. But no one has made adequately clear what was wrong with the old federal programs and what tests should be used to decide whether any proposed replacement is an improvement. In many ways, the national debate about welfare reform was like the debate of a few years earlier about healthcare. It was said that as a nation we spent far too much on welfare, just as it was said that we spent far too much on health. But that is mysterious as an independent claim. It makes little sense unless we are given some explanation of how much a nation should spend on its poor. Why should we think that we now spend too much rather than too little? It was also widely claimed that the existing welfare system had been abused, that unworthy people who could support themselves were instead supported by taxes extracted from hard-working people. That complaint was fueled by images of gloating scroungers taking taxis to the welfare office and of immoral teenagers having babies at the public expense because it beat working. Race dominated those images, as it does so much in our politics, and that is cause for great suspicion that the claims of abuse were overblown. Wait. But of course there was and is abuse. That obvious fact is not in itself decisive that the old welfare programs were fundamentally wrong, however. Rather, it raises mixed questions of legislative strategy and social justice. We want to avoid two evils: a welfare program so porous that it allows extensive abuse, and one so stringent that it denies welfare to many people who need and deserve it. Which of these two evils is the worse? Can we design a welfare scheme that improves on past programs in both respects? If not, what balance should we seek? The Liberals who attacked the bill and pleaded with the President not to sign it conceded that there are grave problems in the existing structure. They disagreed with the Conservatives only in thinking that the Reform Act went too far. But they have done little better than the Conservatives in defending the answers they give to the questions just raised. They have not provided a standard for deciding, even roughly, how much a just society would spend on welfare for the poor, what form such welfare payments should take, or what conditions should be attached to them. Can we do better in defining a fair redistributive scheme? We would have to confront and answer a variety of more specific questions, which we might divide into these categories. Merit. Who, in all justice, is entitled to public support? Is support owed, as some Liberals still insist, to those who cannot find work they think fulfilling? What about someone who can find only distasteful work, or work of low status, or work that does not exploit or challenge his talents and training? or someone who can find work but only at the cost of relinquishing the care of her children to others. Level: to how much support is someone who is entitled to support entitled? What the average person in employment makes, what the nation has defined as a minimum wage, what it has defined as the line of poverty, something more or less. On what principle, other than political compromise, can these questions of level be answered? Administration. Suppose we have adequately distinguished the properties that entitle someone to welfare relief from those that disqualify him. How much should we spend deciding into which of these categories a particular welfare claimant falls? Assuming that every dollar spent on these administrative decisions leaves less for actual welfare payments. Can we afford to define entitlements so as to capture the finest moral discriminations we might make? If not, how should we define them so as to achieve the right balance between administrative savings and individual justice? What procedures, what presumptions and allocations of burden of proof, for example, would a just society use to test whether a particular claimant is entitled to succeed? Dependency. In many cases, those who claim welfare are responsible for the care of others, infants and children, for example. Is it just to limit what such a claimant receives on grounds that his behavior has disqualified him, when the impact will be severe or catastrophic for his dependents? Conservatives say that government should not encourage teenagers to have children by supplying them with welfare assistance when they do. But can we accept a policy that punishes the babies that will inevitably still be born? These are among the difficult questions that a useful account of social justice must acknowledge and try to address. It would be foolish to expect any philosophical theory to answer them in detail, and even more foolish to expect it to provide answers that everyone in the relevant political community would accept. Nevertheless, we should try to provide a structure within which a public debate could usefully take place, a structure that both sets the terms of argument and provides limits to the range of answers that any side could in good faith take to be plausible. 2. The strategic problem. People's fates are determined by their choices and their circumstances. Their choices reflect their personality, which is itself a matter of two main ingredients, ambition and character. I mean ambition in a very broad sense. Someone's ambitions include all his tastes, preferences, and convictions, as well as his overall plan of life. His ambitions furnish his reasons or motives for making one choice rather than another. Someone's character consists of those traits of personality that do not supply him with motives, but that nevertheless affect his pursuit of his ambitions. These include his application, energy, industry, doggedness, and ability to work now for distant rewards, each of which might be, for anyone, a positive or negative equality. Someone's circumstances consist of his personal and his impersonal resources. His personal resources as his physical and mental health and ability, his general fitness and capacities, including his wealth talent, that is, his innate capacity to produce goods or services that others will pay to have. His impersonal resources are those resources that can be reassigned from one person to another, his wealth and the other property he commands, and the opportunities provided him under the reigning legal system to use that property. Distinctions of this sort are essential to our personal ethics, that is, to our own sense of how we should live and when we are living well or badly. We take responsibility for our choices in a variety of ways. When these choices are freely made and not dictated or manipulated by others, we blame ourselves if we later decide that we should have chosen differently. We evaluate and criticize the ambitions out of which our choices are made. We try to reform or overcome those character traits that have led us to make choices we would prefer not to have made. Our circumstances are a different matter. It makes no sense to take responsibility for these unless they are the upshot of choices. On the contrary, if we are dissatisfied with our impersonal resources and do not blame ourselves for any choices that affected our share of these, it is natural for us to complain that others, often the officials of our political community, have been unjust to us. The distinction between choice and circumstances is not only familiar in first-person ethics, but is essential to it. We might think ourselves persuaded intellectually of the philosophical thesis that people have no free will, and that we are no more causally responsible for our fate when it is the upshot of our choices than when it flows only from a handicap or from society's distribution of wealth. But we cannot lead a life out of that philosophical conviction. We cannot plan or judge our lives except by distinguishing what we must take responsibility for because we chose it, and what we cannot take responsibility for because it was beyond our control. We need one more distinction between two types of theories of justice. Ethically sensitive or continuous theories grow out of our internal lives because they base their judgments about the justice or injustice of any distribution of impersonal resources on assignments of responsibility drawn from ethics, assignments that distinguish between choice and circumstance in the way just described. This distinction is amplified in Chapter 2 and 7. The theory of distributive justice that I have been defending in this book, Equality of Resources, is continuous. It aims to make people's impersonal resources sensitive to their choices but insensitive to their circumstances. Ethically insensitive, discontinuous political theories, on the other hand, deploy standards of just distribution that are special to politics and that do not reflect the distinctions and assignments of responsibility we make in leading our lives from the inside. A utilitarian theory of justice, for example, is discontinuous because it makes no room, at the ultimate level of assessment, for any distinction between choice and circumstance as causal determinants. If average welfare would be maximized by a welfare scheme that awarded everyone who is unemployed the same benefits, without regard to whether he is able to find work if he chooses, that scheme would be commended by utilitarian political theory. I argued in Chapter 2 and elsewhere in this book that we should insist on a continuous theory of justice that is drawn from and respects two main ethical principles. The first holds that, from the objective standpoint appropriate to the government of a political community, it is important that the lives of people go well, and it is equally important that each person's life go well. The second insists that nevertheless each person has a special responsibility for his own life, a responsibility that includes deciding what kind of life is appropriate to him and how best to use his resources to secure it. Any society faithful to these two principles must adopt legal and institutional structures that reflect equal concern for everyone in the community, but it must also insist, out of respect for the second principle, that the fate of each must be sensitive to his own choices. The distinction between choice and circumstances, however, is problematic in many ways. There are often formidable difficulties in deciding whether someone's failure to find employment at a decent wage is a consequence of his lack of wealth talent or his lack of industry and application, for example. In some cases, the difficulty is more than epistemic. Some traits of character may be so pronounced and disabling that they seem more like handicaps. Indeed, many of them, extreme indolence, for example, may be symptoms or consequences of mental disease. Most people's personal resources, on the other hand, are much affected by past choices and attitudes about healthcare, physical risks, education, and training. But such choices and attitudes are themselves much affected by unchosen domestic and cultural influences. These latter influences can, however, often be overcome, and though it seems preposterous to suppose, as some conservatives say they do, that hard work can rescue everyone no matter what his circumstances, it is equally obvious that hard work and dedication can help many who would be unemployable without it. These interactions pose a strategic problem for any continuous political theory. How, more precisely, should it draw the distinction between those influences on an agent's fate for which he must take responsibility and those whose influence the community has a responsibility to mitigate? How, in practice, is that distinction to be enforced? 3. The conservative arguments. We can distinguish two important arguments for eliminating or sharply reducing welfare payments to the unemployed. I use unemployed to include those employed only part-time and at low wages involuntarily. The first argument hopes to bypass the strategic problem just described. It claims that people who make money in a market economy deserve to keep what they earn because wealth talent is a kind of merit. The second accepts the strategic problem and insists on a particular solution. It holds that long-term unemployment is so dominantly the result of work aversion or another negative traits of character that it is better for everyone, including the unemployed, simply to presume that all long-term unemployment is avoidable by self-help. A. The argument from merit. Any continuous theory faces the strategic problem I described because such theories do not aim to reward people for their innate abilities, including their wealth talent. High native talent, on that assumption, is good luck, not a matter of merit that deserves tribute. The first conservative argument, the argument from merit, challenges the assumption. It does not suppose that talent is chosen, but rather that it should be rewarded in spite of not being chosen. Conservatives who take that position and many do, in at least an inarticulate way, insist that the wealth some people attract in virtue of their talent is as much deserved as what they earn by sheer industry and application. We must we must be careful to distinguish that claim from others that are not now in point. In another culture, it might be said, for example, that people with more wealth talent are intrinsically more important people, that it matters more how their lives go, and that they should have more resources at their disposal for that reason. That position challenges a basic ethical principle of our culture because it denies that everyone's life is of equal objective importance. The argument for merit, on the contrary, does not deny that proposition. It urges instead an independent ground of entitlement. Government should maintain institutions that reward wealth talent, not because those who have it are inherently more important, but because they have more attributes worthy of praise. I'm reading Sovereign Virtue by Ronald Dworkin. The argument for merit is also different from another familiar argument, that people with wealth talent deserve more because they contribute more to our collective wealth. That latter argument is not apposite when the question is the basic one of what economic structure is a just society would create. Only some structures would encourage or even permit people with more of a certain talent to contribute more to overall wealth. If production was centrally directed, for example, as it has been in some socialist countries, then wealth talents, as I defined them, talents to produce what people actually want, might contribute very little to overall wealth. So the claim that wealth talent produces wealth presupposes rather than argues for a particular economic structure, a market structure in which that claim is true. Of course, it might be argued on instrumental grounds, for example, on utilitarian grounds, that communities should have economic systems of that sort. But the claim that people with wealth talent deserve more wealth would then play no part in the argument. The present claim is that talent deserves reward in virtue of some intrinsic relationship between the two. That is, that people with wealth talent deserve more wealth in the way that the fastest runner deserves to win the race. But the analogy is instructive against the claim. Races and other contests are designed to make a particular property a matter of desert. The relationship they create is not deep. We have no duty to organize races, but manufactured for and by the occasion. No one would have a right to anything in virtue of having the property of speed over terrain if races had never been invented. But the present claim about wealth talent, if it is to be effective, must be a deep one. It must claim that people with the talent to produce what other people want are entitled to financial success, that they are entitled to an economic race that they will win. But then the claim is put that way, it does not seem possible to sustain it. First, it does not follow from the fact that we ought to admire certain qualities of mind or taste or physical skill that the admiration should take a material form. A society that awarded inexpensive medals to its great scientists and artists would in no way be inferior to one that added a check to the medal. Unless perhaps the social vocabulary of the community was such that only money could signal respect. In that case, however, the connection between the virtue and that particular reward would be contingent, not intrinsic. Second, it is deeply implausible to suppose that wealth talents, as such, are virtues, that is, qualities that ought to be admired. What counts as a wealth talent is contingent in 100 dimensions. Until recently, the ability to project a ball into a hoop from a distance uh, low ranked low among wealth talents, and the qualities of mind that have made Bill Gates the richest person in the world were once dismissed as unattractive. True, some more durably admired qualities of mind are widely thought important in producing wealth, such as intelligence, courage, and that encompassing virtue, judgment. But these qualities themselves have dimensions, and which dimension will secure great wealth in a market economy in which only the admiration of selective friends is itself the slave of contingency. Luck is, anyway, by far the most important wealth talent is the catalogue. Being in the right place is often more important than being anything else at all. And though many of us do admire good luck, we know we shouldn't. Even if wealth talent were a virtue, finally, and even if virtue's reward should be cash, it would still be mysterious why the metric and vehicle of the reward should be a commercial market, why, that is, the right reward should be what the person with the virtue can earn before taxes. Why shouldn't it be the smaller but still ample rewards that a CEO can earn after taxes that are used in part to reduce poverty? There is no such thing as a natural market. We use market to designate a range of economic mechanisms, all of them regulated and therefore defined in some way. Government must regulate markets in some way, and the rental value of a particular corporate officer's judgment will be a function, among myriad other things, of whether laws discourage monopolies, regulate industries for safety and conservation, or restrict enterprise in other ways quite unconnected to welfare programs. If there is no canonical choice among these different markets, how can it be clear that the reward appropriate to a financier's virtues must be determined free of redistributive taxes? B. The psychological argument. The second conservative argument, the psychological argument, accepts the challenge of the strategic problem. It agrees that personality and circumstance interact. But it insists that personality is almost always the dominant factor, that people with pluck and stamina make the most of their native abilities and create decent lives for themselves and their families. Those without those qualities, the indolent or feckless among us, fail. It is a mistake to force the successful to bail out the failures for two reasons. First, it is unfair that the ants of the community should be made to support the grasshoppers. Second, it is unwise because it perpetuates a culture of dependency. People find and show application when they have to, but not when it doesn't much matter if they don't. Ending welfare is good for the poor. It is tough love that will help them to shape up and allow them to lead lives of more dignity and self-respect by supporting themselves through work rather than slouching through life on other people's handouts. This conservative argument confronts the strategic problem by declaring a presumption that a lack of application, laziness, irresponsibility, or some other defect of character is responsible for all long-term unemployment, and then suggesting, as a response to the problem, a policy of granting welfare benefits only to those people who can overwhelmingly rebut that presumption. The Welfare Act's decision to terminate all unemployment benefits after 2 years is a refinement of that policy. The psychological argument rests, therefore, on a series of actual premises about the proportion of scroungers among welfare recipients and of predictive judgments about the motivational and behavioral consequences of welfare. It also relies on a judgment of controversial morality, that it is acceptable to deny welfare to those who really need it, however few they may be, in order to punish or coerce those who do not. Liberals respond mainly by challenging the premises and the predictions. But that liberal response suffers from two defects. It does not offer a competing welfare strategy, and it does nothing to reduce the troubling ambiguities of behavioral responsibility that I described. It only matches the conservative presumption with contrary presumptions of its own. It presumes that scroungers are few rather than many. Can we construct an alternate strategy that has more structure? A strategy that relies less on controversial psychological presumptions that are easy for opponents to dismiss, or on homilies about tolerating cheats for the sake of the worthy that are easy for opponents to resent? We might be tempted to turn to discontinuous theories of justice, because these make no fundamental use of the distinctions whose difficulties pose the strategic problem. 4. Familiar discontinuous responses. A. Utility. A utilitarian analysis of the welfare problem asks which welfare scheme would manufacture most utility across the community on some suitable conception of what utility is, like happiness or people's having what they want, for example. Are argued in Chapter 1 that no suitable conception of utility can be found, that whatever appeal utilitarianism has depends on not specifying what utility means, since once any more detailed specification such as happiness or success in one's aim is chosen, it becomes plain that the goal of maximizing utility so defined, even when feasible, is unfair, because at least some people would not take utilities so characterized as of dominant importance for their lives. Utilitarianism, once utility is specified, violates the second principle of ethical individualism. Even if we leave the content of utility unspecified, however, utilitarianism seems particularly inappropriate as a model for welfare reform just because it is discontinuous. It fails to take behavior and choice into account in the way that both politics and fundamental fairness require. Perhaps overall utility would be improved by a scheme that allowed substantial benefits to people who chose not to work because they preferred leisure. A utilitarian would reply that a sophisticated utilitarian analysis could not reach that result because any such policy would reduce the productive labor force of the community, lower its wealth, and therefore lower its average utility. But that reply is unsatisfactory because it is not just contingently wrong to reward those who choose not to work with money taken in taxes from those who do work. It is not just wrong, that is, when we have reason to think that doing so will have some undesired social consequence. That policy is inherently wrong because it is unfair. It might well be, as a utilitarian might now claim, that we would not think it unfair to compensate the indolent unless we supposed, at least unconsciously, that rewarding them was bad for the overall utility of the community in the long run. But that reply confuses the source with the content of our convictions. So long as we do think that forced transfers from the ant to the grasshopper are inherently unfair, we cannot accept an explanation of why it is wrong that turns on a contingent economic prediction. I just imagine that a utilitarian analysis might award too much compensation to the wrong people. It is far more likely that it would award too little to the right ones. For it is not only conceivable but plausible that the prosperity of the United States and the average welfare of its citizens would suffer if it were to institute an effective welfare program that provided a decent living for everyone who could not find work or who had children to care for. It is hard to construct any impressive argument to the contrary. Liberals insist that the long-term negative effects of neglecting the education of poor children or of sustaining an underclass that might one day be driven to violence outweigh the short-term benefits of improving present wealth even when measured on a utilitarian scale. But these predictions are hugely speculative. They appeal to us because we think that it would be unjust to deny many thousands of children a chance to make something of their lives, not vice versa. The difference principle. John Rawls's difference principle declares that no inequality in primary goods is justified unless it improves the position of the economically worst-off group, and those who accept that principle may suppose that it offers a good response to the conservative claim. But there are serious difficulties in using the principle in that way. First, the concept of the worst-off group is too malleable to generate any detailed welfare scheme, because it is likely to make a considerable difference, in applying the difference principle to the welfare problem, how large a band at the bottom we select as making up that group. Measures that improve the prospects of the worst-off decile of the population, for example, may injure those of the lowest quintile, which will include many more low-paid workers, and also the prospects of the worst-off 1%, the severely handicapped and the permanently unemployable, for example, because a program designed only for them would presumably help them more. The difference principle, however, as least as commonly stated, offers no advice about where the ceiling defining the class should be drawn. If we were to stipulate a percentile as defining the class, then the strategic problem I described would present no conceptual difficulties for the difference principle, because that principle is discontinuous. But, like utilitarianism, its discontinuous character prevents it from taking account of choice and conduct in the right way. Compare, for example, the following two welfare programs. Under the first, only those who attempt to work receive welfare, but under the second, everyone who does not work, for whatever reason, receives benefits. It might be that no group in the second program is as badly off as the stipulated worst-off group in the first one, in which case the difference principle would recommend the second program. It may be said, in reply, that this could not happen because the worst-off group in any society would be better off if its economic system provided incentives to work for all who can work. But that is not necessarily true. It may be that some people, how many would depend on how the worst-off group is defined, would so strongly prefer idleness, and they would be financially better off under a scheme that did not punish that choice. The difference principle attends, moreover, only to the position of those who have fewest primary goods. It demands that their position be improved no matter what the consequences for those who will still have more. It seems unfair wholly to ignore the impact of a welfare scheme on people who are not in the worst off group, however that is defined, but who nevertheless must struggle to secure a decent living for their families, and who unsurprisingly feel resentment when part of their hard-won wage is taken in taxes and paid over to those who do not work at all. The difference principle seems most appropriate in times of rising general expectations. It seems fair to use the steadily increasing wealth of the community, so far as possible, to help those whose prospects are particularly poor, when this means only a lessening in the slope of the increase in the resources of everyone else. But global capital mobility now threatens steadily to decrease the general level of wages throughout any prosperous community's non-technical and non-managerial ranks. In these circumstances, it seems callous to say that the the theory of justice has concern are those whose lives are the most damaged, even though others, who work as hard as they can, are also seriously injured. Rawls has never been able satisfactorily to explain why the members of his original position, ignorant of their own future status, would choose the difference principle out of their own self-interest, and the politics of the welfare problem show the practical shadow of that theoretical failure. Politicians who preach fairness to the hard-working middle classes are of course fishing for votes, but they are also giving voice to a widespread instinct of justice. 5. The hypothetical insurance scheme. A. The story. Ethically insensitive theories of justice are unhelpful in addressing a problem so connected to individual responsibility as welfare. Can we construct an ethically sensitive account of a just welfare scheme that does not rely as much on presumptions about causal responsibility as familiar liberal appeals to, and that does not rest on the unsurprisingly resented proposition that hard-working wage earners should subsidize fraud in order to ensure that the genuinely needy are supported? I begin with the utopian story. What follows is a summary and reformulation of the hypothetical insurance approach described in more detail in Chapter 2. Imagine the United States transformed in the following ways. Wealth and other opportunities have been fairly distributed as of some particular moment. Everyone is aware at that moment, however, of global competition, technological instability, increasing average age, and all the other factors that contribute to our own contemporary economic insecurity. Everyone is offered the opportunity to buy insurance providing a stipulated income if unemployed, or employed at a wage lower than that income, and such insurance is offered at community rates, that is, at the same premium for the same coverage package for everyone. Because this is the only nearly impossible assumption, everyone assumes that each person, including himself, is equally likely to lose his job. People make their individual insurance decisions prudently. That is, they decide whether to insure against low income, and what income to insure against not earning in a way appropriate to their dominant hopes, fears, tastes, and values. In a moment, I will speculate about the shape of that imagined commercial market, about what sort of policies would be written, with what coverage and at what rates. But I want first to make an important claim about whatever distribution of wealth could result. No matter what happened, there would be no ground for objecting that undeserving people who could work but didn't, or who could have trained themselves earlier or better but didn't, were unfairly capitalizing on the efforts of those who did work. For whatever benefits were received would be the upshot of market decisions of various kinds that reflected the impact of everyone's choices and everyone's opportunities. No one could object, for example, if a woman who had purchased insurance received a stipulated compensation if she chose to quit her job during pregnancy, because that is what the policy she purchased provided. She would have paid a premium reflecting the cost of that option to others. True, insurance policies might be offered that would provide an opportunity for cheating. A policy might provide that an insurance recipient had an obligation to search for work, for example, and someone might lie about having done so. But though others would presumably condemn his behavior, they would not complain that the institutional arrangements that offered him that opportunity was unfair to them. If a policy that would provide greater protection against fraud had been overall profitable for the insurer, It would have offered that policy at a lower premium, either in place of or in addition to the policies that the cheaters bought. If such a policy was not in fact profitable, an insurer who insisted on offering it would have had to make up his loss by charging more of other policies. It might be in everyone's interests, that is, that the detection system be porous. So in these imagined circumstances, no one could sensibly complain that the scheme was unfair to him because it compensated others. We can make that claim, moreover, without any assumptions about the distribution of causal influences between choice and circumstance on people's educational and employment opportunities, behavior, or success. No one would recover compensation unless he had made the decision to insure. If he had insured in a way that covered unemployment due to lack of technological skills, for example, no one could justly complain that he ought not to be compensated because his character had contributed to his not acquiring those skills. Of course, a mixture of ambition, character, and native resourcefulness might play an important role in someone's decision whether to insure. If someone decided not to purchase insurance he later regretted not buying, he might complain that his choice was influenced by a personality disorder over which he had no control, and that his society should therefore treat him as if he had bought the insurance. But that is not the complaint I am now considering. I am ruling out only the charge that the structure of the insurance market might be unfair to those who do not receive any payments. Contemporary America is different from the America I just imagined in two crucial ways. Wealth is not fairly distributed among us, and the antecedent risk of sustained unemployment is vastly greater in some parts of the population than in others. But we might nevertheless capitalize on the imaginary exercise by asking what unemployment insurance people with a representative mixture of the tastes and ambitions most Americans have — we need not assume that everyone who is representative has the same tastes and ambitions — would buy if they had the wealth that is average among us and were acting prudently. There is no single right answer, I agree, to hypothetical questions like that one. Which insurance opportunities people would be offered, and which of these they would take up, would depend on hosts of contingencies in market and personal decisions that we can sensibly imagine in different ways. But if we could construct a narrow range of unemployment insurance policies such that it is plausible to assume that almost every American who was acting rationally would buy a policy within that range, whatever other insurance he added to it, we could design the core structure of an eminently defensible welfare program based on that information. No, I'm reading Sovereign Virtue by Ronald Dworkin. Merci Geoffrey. Ah, c'est pas, je suis trop moche là en plus. If it is true that almost everyone would have bought unemployment insurance to a particular general level, in the imagined case, then we can confidently assume that some particular person's failure to do so in our world is attributable to the circumstances that either make such insurance unavailable in our community or make it unaffordable for him. For the differences between our world and the imagined ones are unambiguously differences in people's circumstances, differences in wealth, and in the educational and social opportunities that make one part of our community, one actuarial group, antecedently more likely to suffer an insured risk. So the general goal of equality of resources, that distribution should be sensitive to choice but not to circumstance, is satisfied by a welfare scheme that places people in the circumstances we assume they would have enjoyed had insurance been available to them on equal terms. A scheme of welfare benefits generated in this way would have several other advantages over other proposed schemes. It would leave scope for the play of personal choice, the influence of character, and the attraction and utility of gambles. It would not, as more drastic egalitarian suggestions would, squeeze the differences out of persons or lives. It would not dampen initiative or flatten society or compromise any sensible conception of liberty. See Ronald Dworkin, Do Liberty and Equality Conflict, in Living as Equals. It would only insist on what seems an undeniable tenet of fairness. That a society comes closer to treating people as equals when it adds to the choices they would have had were circumstances more nearly equal. It is, moreover, a realistic scheme. Mon micro... Ah, parce que je suis loin. Vous m'entendez mieux là? Since its calculations are modeled on hypothetical decisions of actual people choosing among various calls on their resources, those calculations would never require a community to spend more on welfare benefits than it should given its responsibilities to provide other services essential to its members' lives. Since income taxes used to finance those benefits would be modeled on assumed premiums in that market, those taxes would be both fair and feasible. Dying. No! I'm in France first, and I'm in my room. I just have a lot of books, and this is just a part of it. B. The shape of the market. So we should speculate about the shape of the unemployment insurance market in the imagined world. It might seem, at first blush, that a hypothetical insurance approach would justify, contrary to what I just said, a wholly unrealistic level of welfare, because rational people in the imagined world would pursue a Maximin strategy, that is, a strategy that would set the floor of their prospects as high as possible. In fact, prudent people would not adopt that strategy. All insurance is, in one familiar sense, a bad buy. The premiums must cover the insurer's administration and profits, as well as providing the fund out of which compensation is paid, and premiums must therefore substantially exceed expected return. That is particularly true in the case of unemployment insurance, which inevitably carries, as we shall see, a high moral hazard, the risk insurers run of fraud, including, for example, false claims about attempts to secure employment. C'est la télé. Unemployment insurance makes sense, therefore, only when it protects, not just against having less wealth than one otherwise might, but against being in such a significantly worse position that it is worth a technically bad investment to avoid any chance of it. A maximum low-income policy is therefore imprudent for all except those, if any, for whom any drop from the specific sum it would guarantee would be both salient and grave. It seems equally evident, however, that the consequences of protracted unemployment or extremely low income are sufficiently serious that most prudent people of average means would insure against those consequences to some degree. Ça recommence là? Ou c'est peut-être chez toi? They would attempt to buy coverage that would at least enable them to sustain life with some dignity, provide food, decent shelter, and a minimum level of medical care for themselves and their family. Alors. Là, c'est pareil? C'est pareil, là? Most nations Most nations now calculate that sustenance level for various purposes by defining a poverty line, and we might assume that almost everyone who could afford the necessary premium would insure at least to the level of his community's poverty line. Could people afford such a policy in the imagined community? That depends on the state of its economy, but so long as employment remained the norm across the community as a whole, sustenance coverage would not require a major fraction of average income to purchase, and we can assume that most people would purchase it. We now come, however, to more complex issues about the definition of the insured risk. How would popular policies define the covered risk of unemployment or low-wage employment? It would not, of course, be possible to insure against not having the job one wants. The premium for such insurance would presumably approach the coverage. On the contrary, any affordable policy would stipulate that the beneficiary attempt to mitigate his position by seeking employment. But how would that provision be framed and enforced? It would be possible, of course, For the claims adjusters simply to take people's word, and in certain communities that might well be efficient. But let us assume that in America an affordable policy would require more by way of claims review than that. Now consider the following 4 insurance policies against unemployment. Each policy requires the claimant to seek employment, and under each policy benefits terminate if it is proved that he had been offered and declined a job. The severe policy provides further that coverage for each incident of unemployment ceases if the claimant has not secured a job in 2 years, whether or not he has been able to secure one, and that, in any case, no one may claim more than 5 years of benefit in the aggregate during his lifetime. Ça, faut juste écouter. The generous policy has no cutoff or other form of restriction beyond the provision that the claimant must seek and accept employment. The optional interventionist policy provides no flat cutoff, but it does provide that the insurer may require the claimant to pursue job training at its expense while unemployed, and that he must take any job that it provides or finds for him, forfeiting compensation if he refuses a stipulated number of such offers. The mandatory interventionist policy copies the optional interventionist, but also provides that the insurer must provide training and use its best efforts to find jobs. The severe policy could presumably be offered at the lowest premium of the 4 policies, assuming otherwise identical coverage, because it allows the insurer to economize in 2 important ways. First, since scroungers will in any case receive coverage for only 2 years, the insurer needs to spend less than it otherwise would in a certain process of identifying them. Second, some of those who remain without jobs for 2 years will not be scroungers, but people who lack the skills or training or luck to find work in an economically insecure environment. C'est vrai? Tu l'as demandé? Elle t'a répondu? The insurer therefore saves by offering, in effect, much less than full coverage. It offers not insurance against unemployment, but insurance against a few incidents of short-term unemployment. So the severe policy would certainly be cheaper than the generous policy, and it might also, though this would depend on additional facts, be cheaper than either of the interventionist policies. Normal, elle entend un truc. But it would presumably also be very unappealing in spite of its more attractive cost. People, we are assuming, would buy unemployment insurance at some low level, say at the poverty line, not as a novel form of lottery, but because they are frightened of what they deem a catastrophe. They are driven to insure at that level not because insurance becomes better by investment terms when the coverage is low, but because the risk of not having even that much is terrible, and they would therefore find a policy that does not eliminate the worst of the risk, long-term unemployment, very unattractive. We might therefore suppose that the severe policy would sell badly unless the alternatives were prohibitively expensive. The generous policy would be much more attractive, of course. In common with other policies, it requires claimants to seek and accept work, but that does not in itself impair the coverage most people want. However, the generous policy would also be very costly. An insurer offering it would have to adopt stricter review procedures, and these, if effective, would be expensive. It might find itself managing an unwieldy claims bureaucracy. No matter how elaborate and expensive its review process, it would harbor some scroungers who were attracted to the policy exactly because it offered them a chance of a work-free life, and the less the insurer spent on claims examination and review, the greater its scrounging loss would be. If the other forms of policy were also offered, the generous policy would also suffer from adverse selection, the propensity of people to choose this policy only if there were would-be scroungers of fatally unskilled, and that would force the price of the policy still further up. The optional interventionist policy could not be more expensive than the generous one, because the insurer that offered the former would not provide or finance training or attempt to arrange jobs unless it was in its commercial interest to do so, that is, unless its expected savings from reduced payments foreseeable future. No, unless its expected savings from reduced payments exceeded the cost of those services. Since it seems likely now and in the foreseeable future that those savings would exceed the cost in the case of some claimants, and perhaps many of them, the optional interventionist policy would be cheaper than the generous one. So if that policy were offered in the imagined community, it would drive the generous plan from the field. For most people, all but would-be scroungers, the interventionist features of the plan would themselves add to its value, because training might enable them to get a job paying much more than the covered level, and because many and probably most welfare claimants prefer to work, particularly at skilled jobs. Whether the optional interventionist policy would also be cheaper than the severe policy would depend on a complex calculation. Presumably, some claimants under the severe policy who would receive compensation until its cut-off point was reached could find jobs before that point if training and job assistance were provided. The optional interventionist policy would be cheaper than the severe one if the additional compensation that would have been paid to such claimants under the latter policy was in aggregate greater than the cost of the training and assistance program under the former. The longer the cut-off period under the severe policy, therefore, the more likely that the optional interventionist policy would be cheaper, and since that policy is otherwise much more attractive, that fact puts a limit on the length of cut-off a severe policy could propose. It follows that the only such policies in the market would be the least desirable and presumably least popular ones. The mandatory interventionist policy would be even more attractive for most people than the optional interventionist one, because it promises an even greater chance at a better life. True, the mandatory version would be more expensive for insurers in the short term. But in the long term, this equation would presumably change. Over a generation, for example, barring economic catastrophe, an initially expensive training and jobs program could be expected to be cheaper for insurers than a de facto generous policy would be, and to approach the cost of an optional interventionist package. So insurers might do well to offer a mandatory version of the policy stipulating long-term commitments, and this might prove more popular than the optional version, even if somewhat more expensive. Je fais une pause.